Okay, dear friends, the topic today is Pirkei Avot, chapter 2, and this is Mishnah 5, the statements of Hillel. Sometimes it's difficult to talk during these turbulent times as we're going through the Chomat Magen operation, but on the other hand, sometimes sticking with the regular things of life helps us retain our anchorage and sanity to a certain extent, despite the vicissitudes of the security issues that are going on today. So, as I mentioned, then Hillel has these extra statements that were added in, possibly by Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, after the statements of Gamliel, Rabbi Gamliel, son of Yehuda Nasi. So, we had last week the first statement of Hillel, which was from Mishnah 4, where he said, Al tifrosh min hatzibur, etc., not to break away from the community. Today's Mishnah 5, which are sometimes called 6, is all about Torah study. Remember, Hillel was a Babylonian-born Jew, and then he came to Judea, to Israel later, and was very poor, studied under Shmaya and Avtalion, who were his predecessors in the Sanhedrin. And because one day he didn't have the money to pay for the guard of the Beit Midrash to enter, the entrance fee, he went on the roof. According to the story, it was snowing, and he was so intensely involved listening to the class, he didn't even realize the snow that had surrounded him. Until Shmaya and Avtalion realized there must have been somebody, because all of a sudden it was dark, and they had a window there, and they saw the figure of a person in the window and pulled him down and let him study with them after that for free. So we have here 3 pairs of statements about the study of Torah. The first one has to do with the lack of, and the second one has to do with the lack of, and the third one has to do with the study of Torah. The first one is Ein Bur Yorei Chet, V'lo Am Haaretz Chasid. That's the first pair. You have a Bur and Am Haaretz. In modern Hebrew, we put them together. But Bur, which comes from the Hebrew word bor, which means an empty pit, where nothing's in it. Like it says about Joseph, they threw him into a bor, into a pit. V'habor reik ein bo mayim, the pit was empty, it didn't even have water. So bor is an empty pit, as different than the Hebrew word be'er, which means actually a fountain, a fountainous pit, a pit which has natural source of water. So you have a human being also, which is like a bor, which really has no knowledge. For the Mishnah here, there are 2 types of knowledge. There's Torah knowledge, and then there's just knowledge of life experience, occupation, business, dealing with people. So a Aboor has neither Torah study, neither nor the experience of dealing with people and what to do in a business world, in a world with others. And therefore, Aboor, somebody who lacks experience and knowledge, cannot be Yorei Chet, cannot be sin-fearing, because it needs a certain amount of exposure to society to understand these sensitivities, which our common sense teaches us, and experience teaches us. And if you don't have the experience, you can't even develop your common sense and to know what to do. Rabbi Kook writes in his Pirkei Torah that sometimes a scholar has to take a break from their studies and go and hang out with the common folk in order to be anchored again, because common people have a certain common sense that sometimes the highfalutin discussions of the scholar can forget about. So that's called Ein Bur Yorei Chet. If you have neither Torah study nor the experience in the social environment, it's very hard to keep away from sin, because you don't even realize what you're looking for. And sometimes you can make very inappropriate statements because of that to others. V'lo am haaretz chasid, the second part of the first statement, you cannot be an ignoramus and be saintly. V'lo am haaretz chasid. Now, am haaretz, as pointed out by the Maharal, means somebody who lives the natural life. And the natural life, of course, is that you get a job, you get an occupation, you build a family. That's an am haaretz, a regular human being. It's not necessarily derogatory. Unless, of course, you're a scholar, you might think so. But because we have, for instance, in Breshit, Vayishtachu Avraham la'am haaretz, that Abraham bowed down to the people of the land. There, it's definitely not a derogatory statement. But lo am haaretz chasid means that if you really want to do more than the letter of the law, then you have to be studious. You have to understand. You have to be educated. How are you going to do more than the letter of the law if you don't know the letter of the law? And then you're going to make mistakes, because then you're going to let sentiment take over instead of knowledge. We have a similar phrase to this lo am haaretz chasid, and this phrase we find in the Talmud in Shabbat. It's Shabbat 63a. And Rabbi Abba says the name of Reish Lakish. Reish Lakish, first generation Amorah in the land of Israel, and the study partner of Rabbi Yochanan. And Reish Lakish said, Im am haaretz hu chasid, al tagor b'shchunato. If you have an ignoramus who is acting saintly and piously, don't live in that neighborhood. Rashi explains, she'eno yodeh b'diktukei mitzvot, because he doesn't really know what he's supposed to be doing halachically about the commandments. Ve'ein chasiduto shleima, and therefore his saintliness is not real. V'sofcha lemod menu, and you might actually learn from him. And I want to add, even if you don't learn from him, he might condemn you for you're doing the right thing because he thinks it's wrong. We see this a lot. People who are newly religious, but they're not educated. So they're mimicking everybody and coming to their own conclusions. And they want to do a lot, but sometimes the a lot that they do is just wrong. But they think that those who are doing less than them are no good. That's called an ignoramus who wants to be saintly. The Talmud actually brings an example of am haaretz, of a chasid shoteh, which literally means a pious person who's actually stupid. And the Talmud brings the example of a person walking on the shore bank, and there's a woman swimming in the water. In those days, when they swam also, there was no running water in the house, so people would bathe naked to bathe themselves, to wash themselves. So he sees a woman who's in the water bathing, and she's screaming help because she's drowning. But he turns the other way because he doesn't want to save her, because what are people going to say? You pulled a naked woman out of the water. So the Talmud gives that as an example as chasid shoteh. He wants to be saintly, but he's really stupid. He doesn't have common sense anymore. That's basically what happens. But he doesn't know the Torah law either. And unfortunately, we have a lot of examples as this. My rabbi, the late Rabbi Aryeh Baron, in one of his Sefarim, he writes in his halachic insights. So he talks about what he calls the Baal Tshuva movement in the 80s and the 90s. And he says this is an important movement of Jews finding their roots, and it's great. He says, however, this movement, he says, will only succeed if people also study Torah. You cannot find religious and to be an external Jew. You have to build yourself up as an educated scholar in order to be a real Jew. And he says if it just remains religious observance on the outside, it's never going to be real. That's called Ein Ham Haaretz Chasid. This is a very, very important point. We see this so often. People discover religion, they read a little bit here, read a little bit there, start calling themselves rabbis, who knows what, start teaching classes over the internet, and everybody thinks they have to say, but they have nothing to say. They're just following religious sentiment, and sometimes religious sentiment is wrong. Rabbi Akiva is quoted to say, when I was an am haaretz, when I was an ignoramus, I went and I saw a dead body in the desert, in the Judean desert. And I didn't want the guy to just lie there, so I picked him up on my back, carried him for 40 kilometers back to the city. Mil is the term used there. And when I came to the city to bury him in the graveyard, Rabbi Joshua saw me and he said to me, Akiva, for every step that you took, it's as if you killed this person because you embarrassed him. And the halacha is, meit mitzvah koneh dalad amotav, that when you find a body which has nobody to bury him, which is called meit mitzvah, you're supposed to bury it right there. You don't take him anywhere. So Akiva said, look, when I was an ignoramus and even I tried to do a good thing, I did the wrong thing. So even more so, a person has to be educated to know what the right thing is. It's not about sentiment. It's about knowing what to do. I gave a talk about this on Shavuot, which I don't want to mention now, maybe another time, that sometimes there can be a clash between religious sentiment and what halacha actually says. And when people don't know what halacha says and sentiment takes over, you can be doing lots and lots of damage. And that's called Lo Amar Haaretz Chasid. And do not live in a neighborhood where an ignoramus is pretending to be saintly, because that can be really dangerous. It's like playing with fire. They will tell people to do things in the name of religion, in the name of God, and they have no idea what they're talking about. It's about going to a fake pharmacist who gives you pills and has no clue which pill you're taking, which pill you're giving you. It's going to hurt you in the end. You need that your teachers be scholars and know what they're talking about. Let's continue. That was the first pair of ideas. The second pair of ideas. Lo habaishan lamed, when it comes to studying Torah, if you are embarrassed to ask questions, you will never be able to study. If you're embarrassed to going to class, to showing up, you have to sit on the side. No, you have to ask questions. You have to get out of your shell, because it doesn't come easily. It's a struggle. Education is a struggle. Knowledge and understanding is a struggle. But somebody who's too strict cannot be a teacher, because you also have to be sensitive to the issues of your students. Because if you're too strict, it becomes ego, and your ego is going to interfere with your relationship with your students. It's not that you have to be necessarily on a personal, friendly basis with all your students, but you have to show them respect. You have to meet them on their level. That's all. Treat them as human beings. The Torah is God's Torah. We're all emissaries in teaching that Torah. Im lamarta Torah harbe al tachzik tova latzmecha ki lechach notzarta, as it says here in Pirkei Avot, if you studied a lot of Torah, don't feel so great about it, because that's why you were created in the first place. So, if you want to be a student, you have to get out of your shell and ask the right questions. If you want to be a teacher, don't be over strict. If you need to control the environment, it's one thing. Don't be over strict. Be a human being at the same time. The third pair. Lo kol hamarbe b'schora machkim. Not all people who are so involved in business are able to be scholarly. Because, yes, you're allowed to be involved in business, and that's what you should be, if that's the way you earn your livelihood, or wherever occupation you have. But if you want to be a scholar, you have to give it time. It can't be just an hour here, hour there. If you don't have the possibility of being a scholar, you do what you can do. But if you have that possibility, you can't live a double life. You got to make the decision. So you have to realize it's going to take time. You have to invest time. And so you have to decide what you want to do early down the line. And it's a decision. Not everybody in the world zochel shnei shulchanot can have both tables, as Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, who is both wealthy and scholarly. However, it's interesting, the Talmud says about Yehuda Nasi that he was wealthy and scholarly. Shnei shulchanot, but on the other hand, it also says that he never was interested in enjoying this world. It says at the end of his life, he picked up his two hands and said, I never really enjoyed from this world, even like the fingers on my hands. Meaning that because you have something doesn't necessarily make it the main part of your life. So if a scholar is well-to-do, and there were scholars like that, it will not affect them as long as they're not materialistic. But you cannot be materialistic and a scholar at the same time. The Vilna Gaon, for instance, despite some of the stories that people say, was actually probably middle class as far as income was concerned for various reasons, because of a fund and the family and the community help and other things. But he was never interested in the material world. There's a story that he had a relative of his just got married, and he sees the guy wandering around in the city for a couple of days. He says, "What are you doing?" The fellow says, "Unfortunately, Grandpa, all the wedding presents were stolen. We've been looking for 7 days to find the wedding presents." And the Gaon said to him, "I can't believe a relative of mine would waste 7 days just looking for presents." So it depends where you put your priorities in life. And so if your priorities in life are Torah study and you focus your time, then the other things you do will also be anchored around Torah study. Chaim Volozhin, who we're commemorating 200 years since his passing very soon, he used to say that if a person spends their time in an occupation, in a livelihood, then it says, Kavai Tim La Torah, designate time for Torah study. But if a person is trying to make their main focus Torah study, then they have to designate time for when they do their business and other affairs. It depends where you see yourself. If you see yourself as a person is a person of the world of occupation is the main part of your life, that's okay. Then make time for Torah study so that it enhances you. But if you feel that you're a Torah scholar, make that the main part of your life, and then based on that, after that, try to figure out how much is time do I need in order to do other things in my life. That's what Chaim Volozhin writes. So, Lo kol hamarbe b'schora machkim, when you deal with your worldly matters, this is not necessarily going to leave a lot of time for Torah study. You should just be aware of that. So it is a decision. Ubemakom she'ein anashim mishtadel liot ish, when they're in a place where there are no people, try to be a person. Literally, a place where there is no men, try to be a man. Now, what does that mean? If we're talking about Torah study, and this is the way some interpret it, including Rashi, that if nobody else is studying Torah, so you'll be the one. Don't say what everybody else isn't doing and you're going to, so you shouldn't either. No, if nobody else, then you. There's a story about Rabbi Chia in the Talmud who said that if all Torah was forgotten and destroyed, I would start it all over again. I would get deer hide and I'd start writing it, and then I'd find children and I'd start teaching them, and I'd start it all over again. In other words, we're all the emissaries of the Torah. Don't look around and say, well, what are they doing? Compared to them, I'm okay. No, you have to set the level, you have to set the bar if you feel that you are capable of being in that position. And another interpretation, of course, is that in general, a question of leadership. If you see there's a lack of leadership, stand up and be there, because somebody's got to do it. Don't wait for somebody else. That somebody else might be the wrong person, and you might be the right one. So it's probably true in both senses. Definitely in the sense of Torah study, which seems to be the topic here of this Mishnah, that if there are no others, then you have to do what you can if you feel that you're able to. And it doesn't matter what others think if you feel that you are true and genuine. And the second thing, in general, in leadership, if there's nobody else, stand up and take a position before the wrong person might. So these are all statements of Hillel. Hillel, of course, whose line creates this dynasty of the heads of the Sanhedrin from the first century for a few hundred years. And these are the additional statements of Hillel, which are connecting us from the beginning of chapter 2 up to Yochanan ben Zakkai, which possibly were added by Yehuda Nasi when he edited the Mishnah to Pirkei Avot, but it's interesting because it's not an Avot Rabbi Natan. In the meantime, I wish everybody security and peace. Shalom, shalom.